We're continuing off with Memoirs of a Broken Mind. Part 1 was chapters 1 through 5. We're on chapter 6 now, which is called The People of the Sun, which was a prior Ozfok episode. This one has been slightly changed from the Ozfok one, but I will actually read this one as there are some things that are different. Chapter 6, People of the Sun. I like to go on little day trips with my other friend Gray. I haven't spoken much about Gray in the past because there really isn't much to say about him. What I can say for sure is that Gray and Seven don't get along well. Besides that, Gray has some very unusual issues to deal with. As you know, the Earth has problems turning on its axis, so we have a large device that keeps our planet in motion. Since this mechanism has glitches every once in a while, nights can last for weeks, and day can last only minutes, and vice versa. These are some extreme cases, depending on if the rotations get out of sync or not. Because of this, some people get confused and forget who they are. We have to keep in small communities, so if a person forgets their own persona, another close friend of the community can tell them and hope to jog their memory back into a place. If all else fails, there are backup injections that one can take in case of total memory loss. Most of us aren't too dramatically affected by this. However, Gray has to stay in close proximity with the rest of us for fear that he will lose himself completely during one of these mechanical issues. One day, Gray noticed a strange silver object protruding from the sand while we were walking the beach. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to be something that was hollow, almost like a flute. There was, however, no way to remove it from the sand. It seemed to be attached to a much larger, unseen object beneath the ground. Without much thought, I blew into the object only to hear a very loud horn-like noise from the other side of the ocean, in the distance. At that moment, we could hear sounds of pebbles hitting the water, and then the sand. Tiny stones began falling from the sky all around us. We looked down and noticed these stones were quite unusual. Each stone had a crudely carved image of a sun with a human face. On the back, there were words carved that appeared to be directions to a mountainous location. Gray isn't as adventurous as Seven, but he was the only one of us that actually owned a car. So, it took some convincing to persuade Gray to drive us to this location. We started off going up an extremely high hill. In fact, it was so steep that we were almost vertical. This was utter enjoyment for Seven, who was all smiles the entire ride, and I couldn't tell if this was her reaction due to the adventure itself or because she knew that Gray was completely terrified and having a horrible experience. By the time we reached the top, it was almost sunset. We parked the car and we noticed a small shack, which is the only thing at the top of this mountain. It almost looked as if we were at the top of Tibetan mountains. We proceeded towards the shed and noticed a wooden sign hanging over the doorway with a carved sun into it, much like the ones on the rocks that fell from the sky. We also noticed plates of food displayed in the window, which was close to the ground. They have rice, fruit, and other provisions that would seem to be foods from India. However, they were all dyed in unnatural colors, such as blue pineapple, for example. We entered the shack and into a small square room which was almost completely empty. We were immediately greeted by people who looked to be from India as well. They had offerings of food and seated us at a small table in a room with no lights, but there was a huge window facing out with a magnificent view of surrounding mountaintops. Seven began to eat the food without hesitation, but Gray pushed his portion away. He whispered in my ear that it seemed unclean. Seven just continued to eat and stared at Gray with a half-cocked expression, quickly followed by a roll of the eyes. Suddenly, a small bell rang, and all the yogis got into contortion-like yoga poses while facing the giant window that nearly encompassed the whole wall. And as the sun began to set, and the amber light filled the room, the strangest thing happened. The yogis opened their chests and displayed the inside of their torsos, exposing their hearts, ribs, lungs, and yet stayed completely calm in their positions, as if almost in a frozen meditative state. As the sun went down, the bell rang again, and they all closed their chests and had come out of their yoga-like stances and began to say goodnight to us. The people of the sun were very friendly people, indeed. Chapter 7 is called 7. The night had lasted for almost a week after our encounter with the people of the sun, but you can't help but fall into a depression when it gets like this. I hadn't heard from Seven since the beginning of the week and figured she needed her space again. I decided to leave my house and venture the streets alone. I'm surrounded by an old shipping village with some interesting nightlife. The bars are always open, and they are usually interesting characters walking the streets during the evening hours. On this particular night, however, I was getting bored being alone. I was ready to call it quits and either walk to the shore or simply go back home when all of a sudden I could hear running from behind me. I looked up the cobblestone road to see a figure running towards me, weaving in and out of the street lamp lights in a long black dress. To my delight, it was Seven. Immediately, she grabbed my arm and in pure excitement pulled me with her. She looked at me and said, "Hey, do you want to go somewhere really cool?" Before I could even say yes, she continued to drag me with her. We made our way to a fence in a clearing within the woods. The night was cold and very windy, and the trees swayed in the breeze. We made our way to a large opening of an abandoned sawmill and stood peering into the darkness. Because the wind was so strong that night and the factory was completely open, the air currents rushing through the building made pieces of metal cling and clatter against other pieces. It gave off the impression that people were still working there, almost like ghosts, shadows of those who just never left after the place closed down. She looked at me and asked if I wanted to go in. Obviously, I hesitated, as I was pretty sure there could have been squatters hiding in there, not wanting to be disturbed. At that moment, however, she grabbed my hand and mockingly asked if I was scared. I raised an eyebrow and assured her I wasn't, even though, deep down, I was very nervous. Seven gazed at me with this wild look in her eyes, and I knew all too well. She held my hand harder and pulled me inside the dark, foreboding entrance of the abandoned factory. We walked blindly, hearing nothing but the wind and the loud clanks and bangs from warped, discarded remnants of equipment and metal. It almost seemed like we were walking through a haunted attraction. As we made it through, I could see light ahead. Seven looked amazing in her long, flowing black dress, which was now messy from wandering through our little adventure. I didn't know if it was from the excitement of the moment or the rush I had gotten from being around her, but I stopped and looked at her and commented she was amazing. She pulled away from me as if I'd said something wrong. She paused and walked away, only to turn and scream. She then ran out of the factory, leaving me in somewhat of a confused state. I found her outside, staring up at the rooftop of the factory as if nothing just happened. She asked if I wanted to go up onto the roof with her, and I nodded without saying a word. The rooftop was slippery and very fragile. We sat and looked up at the stars. Seven looked over at me and asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And then looked away. The rest of the night, we didn't say a word to each other. It was so perplexing and so peaceful at the same time. Chapter 8. The Cabin. After a while, it started to get cold, and we decided to make our way off the icy factory roof. There was a rusted ladder grafted to the side of the factory leading down, which I carefully made my way to. Seven slid and jumped onto a tree and carelessly climbed down branch from branch. We made our way through tall grass and brush, all while Seven was apparently drunkenly stumbling and laughing to herself. I could see a light in the distance and turned to motion her to follow me, but she had vanished. Not completely unusual for Seven to disappear, even in an instant. So I ventured onto the mysterious light up ahead. The wind was blowing, and I could hear the clanging of the abandoned factory slowly fade away in the distance. Eventually, I could see the light was coming from a cabin within the woods. The cabin was abandoned, yet a single candle had been lit. The cabin smelled of musty cedar, and the wind blowing in had a crisp coldness that would seem to combat the aroma of the cabin. I went into an adjacent room to find random drawings. These drawings were purely creations of madness. There was an image of a woman turning into thousands of butterflies and flying off into the sky. There were images of giant fish swimming out of an old wooden barn. I jumped back in shock as my eyes met with the darkened silhouette of a person sitting on the bed across from me. "You know where we are, right?" the voice said. My heart was racing, but then I relaxed to see that it was only Seven putting on a creepy voice. She began to tell me that they were in a cabin that a cult used to reside in. Seven looked up with a crooked half-smile. Yeah, a murderous hippie cult used to live here in the 70s. I rolled my eyes and began to look through more scattered items. I found a record that was lodged behind the bed that Seven was sitting on. It was old and scratched, and it had a ripped label on it. From what I can make out, the band was called Seahorse, and under it were the words, Underwater of Sound. Seven immediately wanted it. She liked to collect old records, among other things, but I was reluctant to give this away. I was so intrigued with my find, and I couldn't wait to go home and play the mysterious record. We left the cabin and all of its oddities behind and continued on home. I had reached Seven's house early in the a.m. I bid her good night, and she looked at me and asked if I wanted to come in. I smiled and was a little puzzled. I thought to myself, Seven never wants me to come over her house. And then I realized she just wanted me to come in so she could hear the damn record. So I sighed, I played along, and went in. An overly curious Seven kept looking at the item until I gave in and just held out the record. I guess I was pretty curious to hear it myself. She grabbed the curious item from my hands and played it on her father's record player. There were pops and scratches, followed by what sounded like Gregorian chanting. Seven's smile quickly vanished as she pulled the record from the stereo. I don't want this in my house, she said with an uneasy voice. I changed my mind. She handed the record back to me and started holding her head. She had said that her head was beginning to hurt and she asked me to leave. I asked if she was okay, and she had responded quickly that she was fine. She just needed to go to sleep. I reluctantly sat up and began to leave and took the record out with me. I went home thinking to myself, what could have upset her so much about this old record? I always thought Seven was a little strange, but this just confused me. I always worry about her. Chapter 9. The White Swan. The next day, I decided to be on my own, since there was much to contemplate, especially about the night before. Another storm had just passed, and I felt dreary. My only motivation consisted of rummaging through some old children's books that my mom used to read to me, and which I found in my closet. To my intrigue, I saw a hole in the wall behind the pile of books that was crudely patched up. Curiosity building, I slightly pulled some of the wallpaper and saw that inside the hole was another children's book. The book was pretty beat up and rotting away the corners. It was called The White Swan. Upon opening it up, I saw some odd scribbles in pen that my mom must have jotted down. I also noticed that every other letter within the story was circled in pen. I tried to decipher these letters, and they actually seemed to be directions that were pretty local, actually. This recent discovery was exactly what I needed to get over my slump. This was something I wanted to investigate further, so I walked for what seemed to me an hour or so. Eventually, I found myself surrounded by a lush green forest. Unfamiliar to the area, this energized me. This newfound excitement made me want to jog down the winding road. As I started on my jog, I noticed the warmth of the air, almost like I hit a wall of humidity, and with every step that followed, it seemed to be that I was moving in slow motion. Gravity was beginning to slip again. Every time I pushed off the ground, I would bounce a little higher in step, almost as if I could just about fly. It appeared that I had hit another gravitational whirlpool, which isn't uncommon. Not here. One can never get used to this, and for the most part, it's usually a hindrance. Yet today, I really didn't seem to mind. As I slowly jogged downhill through the warm air, I could only hear the sounds of birds and slight drips of dew off the vegetation surrounding me. There were dandelions flowing in the air all over the place. Following me down the road was a thin stream of water which gently rippled calmly alongside me. To my surprise, there were tiny different colored fish playfully swimming. I felt as if I were surrounded by a rainforest. There were no cars, no people. Up ahead, the road began to bend to the right, and I followed the stream with it. As I made my way around the bend, the forest opened up to a lagoon. The water was warm and inviting, but I could see tiny snakes swimming about. I hate snakes, so I did not venture into the lagoon. In the distance, a white swan was gracefully swimming in the water. The swan took notice of my presence and started its way to the ledge of the lagoon. This was no average-sized swan. As it had gotten closer, I noticed it was almost as large as me. As the swan made its way even closer, at a startling first glance, it appeared to be that blood was flowing beneath it. But upon closer examination, I had become aware that it wasn't blood at all, but rather beautiful red flowers were blooming underwater as it approached me, almost as if it were a reaction to the swan's presence. The swan started to whisper to me, but I couldn't hear what it was saying. It motioned for me to get closer, and I could just barely hear what it was trying to say. Its words, if anything, were somewhat prophetic. The world will stop turning, like the pages of a book nearing its end. This world should have ended a long time ago. With that, I started getting very dizzy and confused. I lay down near the edge of the water and watched the swan slowly swim away. When I came to, I was in my bed with a pile of children's books around me. The White Swan storybook was in my hand and turned to the last page, which had been missing.